Hi, Betsy.
Hey, Trish.
I
Good
don't know.
morning.
I can't put my video on.
Hmm.
You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
I know.
Really, Betsy, don't you love me?
Well, I don't understand what um, try now.
Okay. Ooh, there I am.
You are. Absolutely. Good
Hi.
morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Pretty good.
If I start coughing, I'm going to mute. Well, I'll be muted, right? Except for the speakers during the thing.
Well, you'll need to mute yourself because I put you as a panelist.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. If you're going to introduce me today, please remember to say I was a special ed teacher and that I did that stuff at Butler, just to let people know that I'm just not.
I was going to say everybody already knows who Trish is, but
Not everybody. Not everybody. Hey, you know what I wanted to do? Do you have other things you want to talk about before people hop on?
the webinar is open so they can come in whenever they want.
Okay, I'll talk to you later on.
And we're recording too, so.
It's nothing bad. It's nothing that would cost us $5 million.
I'm sure not. I think
How many people are we expecting today?
there are only about a dozen signed up.
Good.
But if it's, and it usually not everybody shows up. So
I'm familiar with that.
I'm going to go ahead though and share my. Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
Uh-oh. That looks more like it. Excuse me.
For baby.
It's yuck. It's a little yuck, but getting better.
Well, that's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very important.
I'm actually in the beautiful town of Rome, Indiana.
Are you?
Well, our mother by marriage needed to go live in a care facility. So my sister had been here. This will be day 5. And after day 3, you get kind of nutty. She's doing the odds and ends and putting all the papers together. And so I came down last night.
Oh, good. No, actually, we have a bunch of people here, so
In the waiting room?
Great.
Good.
Brandy Gentry's here, Ton Harmon's here, Kevin Kerr is here, Ryan Micus. I hope I'm saying that name correctly. So
I don't know him. I know
Okay,
Don Harmon.
well, maybe Ryan can introduce himself in the chat window, and maybe everybody can sort of introduce themselves in the chat. And that would be great. And we are at starting time plus a minute. So we'll get started here in just a minute. Give everybody else just another moment or two to join the fray. And I see something in the Q&A. Chat is disabled. Well, what that all about? That's not good. I know I would never have set this up as a. Actually, we're a small group today. So what I'm going to do is simply that's not doing it. I will go ahead and okay, so I have enabled anybody who would like to. Oh, here's Michelle Gruey coming in. So we're a small group today. And so I've allowed anybody who wishes to talk in the webinar. So you'll need to unmute yourself to do that, but you can. And I want to welcome everybody to our webinar this morning on the science of learning. I'm Betsy Hill, president of Brainware Learning. I have a couple of colleagues joining me today. One is Trish Whitcomb, who is the Brainware Learning Advisor for Indiana. She has an extensive background in special ed and all kinds of certifications and things for that, and has studied applied neuroscience at Butler. So she is well versed in all the kinds of stuff we're going to talk about today. And also joining us, I'm sure shortly, will be Tom Hughes, who is the principal of Maple Crest STEM Middle School in Kokomo. And he's got a wonderful story that he's going to be sharing with us. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We are recording our session today, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording afterwards, probably tomorrow. And so you can share that with any colleagues you would like to. Also want to remind you that we're doing another of these training sessions tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. Eastern time. And if you would like to, encourage a colleague to attend that, anybody who wants to, of course, that's another opportunity. Apparently, I have done something that I did not intend to do with the chat, so I apologize for that. So questions or any comments or anything you want to share, just put in the Q&A. And I don't think I showed chat previews. No, I don't know. I never set a webinar up without chat, so I don't know what I did today, but we will persist. If you requested a certificate of participation for PD, then we will be sending those out after tomorrow's session. Probably should see it sometime next week. You will automatically get that if you signed up. And I think that's it. Trish, did I forget anything?
The webinar tomorrow starts at 12:30.
Oh, 12:30. 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central, right? I didn't do that translation correctly, but okay. Thank you for correcting that. And Tom Hughes has joined us, and I am, looks like Tom is all in good shape. Okay, so also you can use this QR code, or you can use the link. I posted it in the chat, but maybe I can post it in. I'm going to respond to Ryan's entry in the Q&A, and I put the link to the download the slides. So a couple different ways you can get that. So what we're going to do today is spend some time talking about the science of learning. We take for granted teaching and learning and talk about them a lot, but we want to dig in a little bit underneath the surface and really talk about how learning happens, the skills that students need to be able to learn efficiently, and how we can help them actually improve those skills. Tom Hughes, the Maple Crest Middle School principal who's joining us today, and I see him in here. We're just very grateful to have him with us today. We'll be talking about his experience helping students understand and strengthen their learning capacity. And then we're going to, at the end, dig into a little bit what it means. I don't think that anybody on today's webinar actually has taken the Mindprint assessment, the cognitive assessment. So we won't be talking about you. Well, you will be thinking about you and your learning strengths, because I'm going to ask you to do that, but I don't have a big reveal of anybody's cognitive profile today, but I think you'll find it really interesting as you start to think about what we can understand about individual students and how they learn. So teaching and learning are words that we use all the time. We use them, we probably take them for granted. And just for a few minutes, I'm going to unforgrant them, if that's a word, and see if we can just talk a little bit about it. So I found a few definitions of teaching that I thought were interesting. And I'm going to share them here. One is from dictionary.com and the Cambridge English Dictionary and Merriam-Webster. And when I came across these, it struck me that I thought that one was a little bit different from the others. Usually you read sort of the same thing in different dictionaries, but so now I want to see, here's something we can try out. If anybody knows how to use their annotation tool, see if you can use your annotation tool and just put a mark, if you can, next to the one that you think might be different. So is it this one or this one or this one? I want to see if we'll experiment with our technology today. So that if you aren't familiar with the annotation tool, you go up to where it says you're viewing my screen, and there should be a view options drop down, and then you should be able to choose annotate. Okay, I don't see anybody, and I know there's some really smart, capable people here, so that must not be something. Oh, there we are. Trish was able to choose hers. So, and you can also type in the Q&A. So I think the Merriam-Webster is a little bit different than the others. The others don't actually say that anything has changed necessarily in the person being taught. The Merriam-Webster one says that somebody ends up knowing something that's really different rather than presenting. And that's most likely why you're here today. There's been a lot of teaching of reading and math and other subjects going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. But for many students, that teaching hasn't resulted in being able to read very well or calculate or think critically or any of the other things that really is our intention of teaching and learning. So now I'm going to turn it around and ask you to think about what is learning. And because we are not able to use the chat right now, I'd like you to type it in the Q&A if you would, or just unmute yourself and share with us verbally how you would define learning. Everybody a minute here.
This is Tom here, but I would say learning is the acquisition of new knowledge, and it could be knowledge of content, could be knowledge of a skill, but knowledge of an acquisition of new material.
Okay. Anybody else? Oh, I see something here. Obtaining knowledge or a skill. Okay, great. And that's the typical answer. That's what we sort of understand it to be. And it's something that we measure in that way. Does somebody have that skill? And we can many times try to figure that out. And that's how we talk about learning. But we talk about learning a little differently. And what we know is that learning is actually a biological process. And what learning is the making and strengthening of connections between thousands of neurons into neural networks or maps in our brain. And so it's a physiological change. It's the connecting of neurons in our brains. We have a whole bunch of them. We'll talk about that in a moment. And so there's that physical change, that physical structural change that occurs when learning happens, means that when we try to then to remember something, what we are doing is reactivating that network of neurons. We're reconstructing, reactivating those connections that were made when we had that original learning experience. What the neuroscientists like to say is that neurons that fire together wire together. So every time we reactivate that set of neurons that were activated at the time of learning, we're strengthening those connections or making them stronger. Every time our brains connect them and activate them, that link gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And so they're not obviously physically wired together, but they wire together so that when we activate part of that network, it's going to activate the network itself much more easily. And so what this looks like, or what this means in our brains, is that our brains are composed of, we have about 85 billion brain cells, neurons. We also have some other kinds of cells that support our neurons, but 85 billion of them. And you'll see anything from up to 150 billion in the literature, but most recently there's consensus that it's about 85 billion. You don't need to mourn the passing of 50 billion cells. We have plenty of them to do everything we need to do as humans, to learn and everything else. Because it's not necessarily the number of neurons, it's the number of connections. So what you're seeing here is a diagram of a little picture of 3 neurons that are, you can see the little dots in the cell bodies. And each neuron has, that's the nucleus inside the cell body. And each neuron has an axon. Oops, sorry about that. Which is the way that it sends a communication to another nerve cell. And it does that via electrical signals that travel down the axon. And then when it gets to the juncture or the synapse, which is where it connects with another neuron, that's where it uses neurotransmitters that dumps a whole bunch of little chemicals into that little gap between the 2 neurons. The neuron that's taking in it has all of these little branches spouting off of the body of the cell called dendrites. And we've just thousands and thousands of dendrites. About 90% of the neuron surface is covered with dendrites. And that's so it can get information from lots of different places, lots of different cells, and all those connections. This is the basis. This communication between these nerve cells is the basis of all human behavior. This is what learning means. This is what our students are doing. It's what we're doing. It's what's happening in your brains right now. So our brains are a very, very busy place. This is a slide of what neurons actually look like in our brains. And you can see the little dark dots, this is obviously magnified. You could fit 30,000 neurons on the tip of a pin. And so they're just obviously very tiny if you think about 85 billion of them in your head. And you can see all this mass of connections, all of these ways, and all of these are transmitting signals, connecting with each other, taking in signals, either to activate another neuron or to deactivate, to tamp its activity down. All of this is what's happening in our brains. But our brains didn't start off with all these connections. So this is a picture, 2 slides of neurons in a newborn on the left. And you can see the neurons with their axons and dendrites floating out, just very few of them. And then you can see the picture on the right, which is the cerebral cortex neurons in a 2-year-old. So what happens is that our brains get to be about 90% of the adult size by the time they're 5 or 6. It weighs about a pound when we're born, but then continues to create these synapses at an amazing rate, 1 point in synapses per second from the time that they start to do this in utero until we're 2. It's a lot of, think of this, just trillions and trillions of connections. And that growth that happens, so between until we're 5 or 6 and we're pretty much the adult size of the brain, is not more neurons. What it is more connections. And our brains are responding to the world by creating these connections that reflect it. And this is actually then a picture of learning. This is what happens when we create these connections. Now, it turns out that our brains at 2 have actually overproduced. They have too many connections because they've been so responsive to what's going on around us. They've created a lot of unnecessary connections. And our brain's job at that point is actually to prune some of them away. So if you ever wanted to know what the terrible twos looks like, it's this picture on the right. And it turns out that our brains actually do this a second time in our life, and I bet you all can guess what it is. And I'm just going to check and see. Slides are not changing on the screen. If you're not seeing this, Trish, you're seeing the slides change? Okay, I see you nodding. So yeah. Right. Yeah. So what you may need to do is refresh, or you may need to leave and come back into the webinar. I don't know why that would be otherwise. So our teen years, adolescence is the second time, which won't surprise anybody if you have raised a teenager. But it also means that those teenage years, so Tom has a whole building full of these brains. It turns out that it's an amazing time for learning. There's just a ton of accelerated learning that can happen at this stage. So it's not all bad news. So why is this important? It's important because we don't transmit knowledge. We don't take whatever is in our heads and transmit it to students. Every student's brain has to build its own understanding and skills by creating and strengthening those neural networks. And our brains can create these networks as they interact with the environment. So if you think back to watching a baby try to learn to walk or to grasp something, and it's that repeated efforts and trying to do it and getting closer and closer to it that actually hones and makes more efficient the connections that actually are going to allow us to do that. So every learning experience, including the one that we're all participating in today, physically changes our brains. And I think about that whenever I'm teaching a class or doing any training, I think about the fact that brains of whoever I'm engaging with, including my own brain, are going to be different after this experience. And I think it's a pretty awesome responsibility and pretty exciting to know that we can do that. So we talk a lot about teaching and learning, and because of what we've been talking about just now, we turn it around. We think it's really important. Oh, it was supposed to do a really clever thing here. Let me see if I can make it do that. No. All right. It's supposed to oh, there it is. Now it's doing it. I don't have a lot of special effects, but if I have one, I want it to work. That we always put learning first, because we know that if there's not learning going on, that doesn't really matter how much teaching is going on. And I know when I started off teaching, I wasn't always as conscious of that as I could have been and should have been. So because learning is so important, I'm going to ignore the fact that I've been trying to teach for now. And what I want to do is hope that something has struck you and give you an opportunity to reactivate those neural networks. We know that reactivating them strengthens them. So when we reactivate them, you're going to make that memory more durable, something that you're more likely to remember. So I would jot down on a piece of paper. Obviously, we're having trouble with the chat window, so you could type it into the Q&A, and or you could simply unmute yourself and share it with us. So I'd like you to pretend that a friend, a colleague has just joined this session, and they're whispering to you and saying, okay, what did I miss? And I want you to tell them the most important thing that they missed. And if you don't want to share it, that's okay. It's always nice if people do, but the most important thing is that you're thinking about this and doing something with it. When you are interacting with whatever it is that you are working with or learning about, then that's going to strengthen those connections. So since we're going to put the focus on learning, and what we're going to now do is to try to understand how learning happens. So the processes that our brains use, this is not now at a biological level, but at a sort of more of a process skill level, and the ways that our brains have organized themselves to be able to more efficiently take in information. So this is a chart that we use to talk about cognitive skills. And cognitive skills are the processes that our brains use to take in information and to learn. So they're the foundation for learning, the infrastructure for learning. It's the how of learning. And so what we have in this chart up on the top is the reasons that we all are in this field of education. We want our kids to get as far as they can and want to academically. We want them to get a good job. Eventually, that's going to support them and their family. We're going to want them to be healthy and contributing members of society. And so we're not, although it sometimes probably feels that way to us, we're not educating them for the state standardized tests. We're educating them for life. And we do that by focusing down at that second tier here on this little step chart, where we focus on reading and writing, math, science, all the rest of the curriculum, increasingly social and emotional learning, or however you refer to it. Might be whole child, it might be self-management, it might be a whole bunch of things. And in order to do all of that, there's this infrastructure. There are these processes that our brains use to be able to learn those things. And it starts down at the very base with what we call foundational cognitive skills. And these are things like attention and visual processing, and auditory processing, and processing speed, the basic ways that information gets into our brains from the outside world. So as that information is coming in, neurons are being activated, and we have to make sure that those processes are working well in order to be able to do that. If they are working efficiently and accurately, that's great. We get a great start to the learning process. But if not, then we're going to have some stumbling blocks. There are going to be some gaps. And what I'd like you to now is focus on one of the obvious skills that most of us probably think about a fair amount in our classrooms and in our work, which is attention. And if you are someone who is fortunate enough to have had a classroom full of students with great attention skills, I would like you to raise your hand. And you can either unmute yourself and claim that, or you can just click on the raise hand, or you can type something in the Q&A. And of course, as usual, nobody responds to that because we all know that's one of those more obvious ones. Some of these others are more subtle or more difficult to get at, but they are nonetheless sort of the gatekeepers of getting information into our brains to start those physiological changes that are going to happen. The next tier up are a special group of cognitive skills that are called executive functions. And educators these days are hearing a lot about executive functions. Most are familiar with the term. And for good reason. These are highly predictive of everything else above this on the chart. And there are 3 core executive functions, and we're going to talk about them more in a little bit. But working memory, just holding information in our mind while we think about it. Inhibitory control, which is how I stop myself from punching somebody in the nose if I get mad at them. And cognitive flexibility, which is how we figured out that we had an alternative to the chat window because it's not working today, and had to problem solve and think in some different ways and adapt to the situation. And then higher order executive functions. And these read pretty much like 21st century skills, or lots of other ways to refer to them, but reasoning, problem solving, planning, all of those kinds of things. And what this chart shows is that these are all stepping stairs or infrastructure or underneath required for reading and writing and math. They're not just, oh, nice to have along the side. They're actually integral in the learning process. And we don't always, I think about that. So if we now focus a little bit, okay, we say now we need to learn to read, we can look at the cognitive processes associated with reading. Of course, there's a lot of discussion today about the science of reading, and it's getting a lot of attention in Indiana. I'm not, the New York City Department of Education has just recently announced, it was a big news article in the New York Times yesterday, I think, or the day before, that they are going to require all of the city's public schools to choose from one of 3 curricula that are presumably based on the science of reading. And what the science of reading says is not probably a whole lot different from what you've thought about in terms of what are the basics of reading over the years. What it does do is put a lot more emphasis on phonics, phonemic awareness, in the decoding process. So sounding out words rather than simply recognizing sight words. So these are all important skills: decoding, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. We cannot be good readers without them, but they are also not, in a lot of ways, the most basic. So there's no decoding part of our brain. In order to decode words, to sound them out, our brains actually have to build connections that aren't there and don't develop based on our evolution. We evolved for language, spoken language, but we did not evolve for reading yet. Or someday we may have kids who are born knowing how to read. I don't know. But I know I won't be around when that's happening. So, but if you think about what's happening when decoding, skills like attention and visual discrimination, sequential processing, keeping things in the right order as they come into our brains, are essential for the decoding process. So if those are not working efficiently and accurate, we can teach decoding and phonics and still have children who understand that and can do that, but still have difficulty with reading. and with the basics of reading. The same is true for fluency, vocabulary, and particularly when we get to comprehension. And that's where most of our worries. We get a lot of kids where they can read out loud and they can pass the fluency tests and all of that kind of thing. But we have a lot of concern that we hear. I know you guys are experiencing it as well, where kids can read but have difficulty telling you what it was all about. Working memory and visualization in particular, and verbal reasoning play a big role in comprehension. And so if those skills are not well developed, we know there are going to be reading struggles. And the reason for those reading struggles is most likely those underlying cognitive skills. The same principles apply in math, everything from basic counting and operations all the way up through algebra, geometry, calculus. A lot more emphasis these days on application and problem solving with math, and their sequential processing, working memory, reasoning, cognitive flexibility. All of these are going to play important roles in how well our students can do all of these things. Now, of course, you're hopefully noticing, and if you are, pat yourself on the back, that many of these skills are the same that you saw on the previous slide about reading, because we have one brain and we take it to reading class and we take it to math class and we take it to social studies, take it everywhere we go, and we use those same skills, just in sort of different ways and different combinations. The emphasis a little bit different, but all of these skills are important parts of learning. Now, one of the things that the fact that we're actually talking about this today is fairly unusual. What we know from the research is that, and it's unfortunate that it's unusual, and that's what we're trying to address, of course, here, because we know from research that academic outcomes, about 50% of the variance in academic outcomes is predicted by students' cognitive skills. So more than any other factor in the education system or process, more than class size, more than teacher quality, more than technology or curriculum or any of those other things. In general, schools spend most of their resources, of course, on academic aspects of the education process rather than cognitive. But what we know is that these are really important predictors and will have a lot to do with that. So we'll see shortly how all of these play a role. Of course, there are a lot of reasons that children come with cognitive skills that are not as strong or cognitive skills that are stronger. We all have cognitive strengths and weaknesses. And if you looked at some of the skills on that chart, and we're going to focus a little bit more on them, you can probably say, well, I'm really good at that, but not so good at this. And we all know that students come with widely varying cognitive skills, from gifted to really, struggling, twice exceptional. And there are lots of reasons that we can point to for why this happens. Poverty has been shown to have a huge impact on cognitive development. ACEs, early childhood adverse experiences, and stress can do that. Learning disabilities, which come from a lot of different places, conditions and diagnoses like ADHD and autism. So there are a lot of reasons for it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where they come from. We don't have, because we can't really solve these things, but what we can do is understand cognitive strengths and weaknesses, and we can then work on improving them. So what I want to do now is take a look and think about, just to do a sort of specific example to bring this home, hopefully, by thinking about how we would, how two different students who come to our classroom, and these are examples of someone kids who could show up in any of our classrooms on any given day, and probably do. And what we're looking at here is their cognitive profile. So the blue box contains skills that are in the expected range or typical for those students. This purple box on the bottom right is skills where they're going to need support. And the strengths, if there is one, is where they perform significantly better than their peer group. And what I've done is put a little box around verbal memory and visual memory. So verbal memory is our ability to commit information to memory that is things that we see or hear, read or hear. So it's language-based information. And then visual memory is our ability to remember information that we have seen, an image, a chart, a graph, a picture, a diagram, those kinds of visual inputs. And so what we have here is one student, student 1, who has very strong verbal memory and very weak visual memory. So far easier time. It's not that they can't remember information. It's just that their brains are much more efficient, much more capable of remembering. And this is true for most of us, by the way, that almost every student has stronger visual or verbal memory. It does, there are sort of plenty that do have them pretty equal, but far more common is that one is stronger than another. These are a little bit maybe extreme, but we see this all the time. And student 2 has just absolutely fantastic visual memory and very, very weak verbal memory. All right, so now what I want to do is consider a typical vocabulary learning assignment that these students might get in their classroom. And hopefully they don't get this assignment at Tom's school, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And we've probably, I've certainly got this kind of assignment. Most people I know have. This teacher says, I want you to take these vocabulary words. I want you to write each word. I want you to write the definition of the word. And then I want you to use the word in a sentence. And I want you to write that down. So I want to think about those 2 students that we just talked about. And which one is going to find this assignment to be the most effective. And it probably doesn't take a lot of imagination here, as I really sort of set this up, but obviously the student who has strong verbal memory, this is a great assignment for them. They're going to practice it. They're going to use it in words. They're going to have lots of words and words and words and words that they can remember. But the student who has weak verbal memory and strong visual memory, imagine what that's like. They're going to labor through writing the word, writing all those things down, and it's not going to stick. It's not going to create that strong neural network that is easy to reactivate. Whereas if we gave them a picture, so this kind of situation, the obvious thing is to give students some alternatives and to suggest to a student who has strong visual memory that they draw a picture that represents this to them, that they maybe color it, that maybe they, do use different colors to highlight things in their notes and things like that, because that is what's going to really enable them to best remember it. So that was an example. Hopefully that was helpful in indicating how important and how different these cognitive skills can be and the kind of impact it's going to have on learning. So memory skills are important, but in terms of predicting student outcomes, executive functions are even greater predictors in general. And I know you're familiar with the term executive functions. Most teachers, I find, associate executive functions with self-regulation and self-management, and don't really understand that there are these 3 aspects to, core executive functions, and don't always appreciate how these skills will impact both academics and behavior. So we think about executive functions. I think most people do in terms of the kinds of behaviors you're going to see, how organized students are going to be, how disciplined they're going to be, cooperative they're going to be, how responsible they're going to be, but not necessarily how well they're going to get along with others. But what we know is that these skills are also essential for learning to take place and for academics. So if you think about working memory, it's the same process in our brains, whether we are keeping track of where we are and solving a multi-step math problem, or keeping in mind what we need to do to understand what somebody is saying us, or to follow a set of instructions that someone has given us verbally. Inhibitory control is the same cognitive process, whether we are not blurting out a word when we are reading. Actually, blurting words, the research says, is more associated with inhibitory control or the lack thereof than pure guessing. And it's the same process as when we are not punching somebody in the nose or not blowing out the birthday candles on somebody else's birthday cake. A cognitive flexibility, again, the same cognitive process, whether we are solving a problem and our first approach doesn't work, or whether we are looking at things from different perspectives and understanding different people's points of view. I want to focus now and dig in a little bit on one that does get a fair amount of attention and is critically important, especially when we come to reading comprehension. And it's also very important for math problem solving, as I'm sure Tom will tell us. So what I like to do at this point, I'm going to check my time just for a second. Okay, so I may do, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to not have us actually, no, I think we can do this pretty quick, just a couple minutes. But working memory is our only conscious processing. It's where we think, where we manipulate information, where we try to understand, where we pull that. And it's limited in capacity. We all have limits on it. The brains have virtually unlimited long-term memory capacity. But to keep something active and to think about it is limited. So what I want to do now is to give you a little experience of what it's like to try to read when you have a limited working memory. And what I'm going to do is declare for the moment that our familiar old alphabet is going to be replaced by the Russian alphabet. So when you can see the translation here. When you see an A, you can say it's an A. If you see something that looks like a B to you, it actually makes the V sound. This little funky thing that looks sort of like a D is a D. This is an E. This thing is an I sound. This backwards N. So you can see all that. So if we take this word and then we look back and to figure out how to pronounce and how to say those letters, this word, the first letter here makes the sound. I didn't say that very well, but the P sound. This backwards E, it makes an E sound. And the little H makes an N sound. So this word is not the actual Russian word for pen, but if we just pronounce it, we hear pen. Okay, so that's how we decode it. And what I want you to do now is try this little sentence and give everybody just a couple of minutes here to try to figure out what this says. And so you can feel welcome to type it into the Q&A window, or just to unmute yourself. This is like, the game shows on TV. You can unmute yourself instead of pressing the I know the answer button. So if you have a guess, you could do that as well. I had someone the other day who actually studied Russian, and so had the answer in mere seconds. Okay, so if you're still struggling with it, if we simply pronounce it, it says decoding puts heavy demands on working memory when not automatic. So if you were trying to do this, did you write it down? Did you transliterate it, transcribe it, letter by letter, which is what a lot of people would do. But the point is, when we have to struggle to that degree with decoding, comprehension probably is not. It probably took you where you had to like translate it and then rewrite it and then read it before you could actually understand it. So when working memory is limited, we're going to have those kinds of struggles just with comprehension and with reading. So just to recap a little bit, some principles about cognitive skills I hope you will be taking with you. Cognitive skills are how we learn. It's how learning happens. It's how our students learn. It's the same mental processes, whether we're reading, doing math, or anything else. Even playing basketball, soccer, football, tennis, whatever it might be, interacting with others, acting in the school play. These are the skills that we use for all of these. Everybody on this call and everywhere else in the world has cognitive strengths and weaknesses. We're all born with the ability to develop these skills, but not everyone has developed them to the same level of cognitive efficiency and capacity. But we can also develop these to a greater degree than most people realize. And that's what we're going to focus on in the next portion of today's webinar. But before we do that, and we're actually going to have a chance to hear from Tom about how his students at Maple Crest Middle School actually did this and got stronger in terms of their cognitive capacity. But I want to pause now and take some questions. So again, please feel free to type them, any questions you have in the Q&A, or to unmute yourself and ask. Okay, I know I didn't do that good a job. Okay, well, I know questions often come up later, and certainly welcome them at any point. And what I want to do now is turn things over to Tom Hughes, principal of Maple Crest STEM Middle School in Kokomo. Tom is a former science teacher, very dedicated to furthering STEM education across Indiana. He's achieved some pretty remarkable success in his school turnaround efforts there. As an administrative and urban STEM middle school, he inherited a really struggling school with low test scores. And he has been able to implement a variety of targeted interventions. He's very data-driven, as I'm sure he will share with us. So he is very rigorous in the way that he approaches his choice of interventions and measuring their effectiveness. And over the years, the school has seen really significant gains in academic achievement and also student engagement. Tom has a master's degree in educational administration from Purdue and is currently pursuing, I don't think he's quite done yet, his doctoral degree. If he is, he'll correct me, I'm sure. So, Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Betsy. Yeah, currently all but dissertation. We are, for those that have been through it, finished with chapter 3, waiting on some data so that I can go through chapters 4 and 5. I just want to thank you for the time to be here and talk about my school, talk about our process. those that are listening. I'm not anybody special. I'm just a former science teacher. Kind of went through a come to Jesus meeting with my principal at the time, and she pushed me into administration. Came here, took what I learned as a science teacher and trying to apply it to administration. And so 7 years ago, I showed up as assistant principal the first year, principal the last 6 years now, and for the most part, just trying to find out what works for our kids. In the world of education, there is probably a dozen emails you get every single day from a vendor, from somebody who tells you they have something that works for someone. The good thing is, as kids get older, they get smarter. But the goal for us as administrators and educators is, what do we find that close gaps? Every kid at the end of the year, with a few exceptions, is going to be more proficient than they were to start with. The problem is every year they get a year older, their grade goes up a year more. And what we find most often is kids who are behind, kids who have not yet grown a academic year per calendar year, are the kids who continue to not grow at a pace that is even on par with their physical age. And so finding a way that not only they grow a year in a year, they've got to grow 2 years in a year, or a year and a half in a year. That's the only way we close the gaps. And so my journey started, and I started responding to some of those emails that we all get where, I tried this reading program, or I tried this intervention plan. And some of them worked for my kids, some of them didn't work for my kids. Some were really hard to implement, some were easier to implement. And I started kind of parceling off little science experiments. And so through my experience, and one of the vendors that I sought out was the Brainware product, because it was just different than everything else. It wasn't a new leveled reader. It wasn't a science kit. It wasn't a online reading platform where I can search some articles, I can find some questions, I can get some Lexile levels, and I can differentiate that way. It was different. It was about giving the kids something that they can do rather than giving the teachers something that they can do. All too often in education, it's what more can teachers do, what more can teachers do, what more can teachers do. And at the end of the day, in a lot of schools across the nation, teachers are burned out. Teachers have nothing else that they can do. Now, sometimes there's a tool that helps free them up, but what makes Mindprint different, what makes Brainware different, is it thinks about the child's thoughts, and it gives the teachers not academic proficiency data, but when they take Mindprint, they start to see what the child's brain strengths are, what the brain weaknesses are. So instead of, as teachers, we talk about differentiation, we have different learners, there's learners that move, but we now know scientifically what kind of learners we have and how do we tier in our intervention. And then what Brainware does is it allows those kids to address some of those problem areas and actually start making gains. It was, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, the conversation of is mindset fixed? Is mindset growth? Is this a duet conversation? And I think we have started to realize that we're not stuck with what we started with. And there are some things that are hereditary. There are some things that you are born with. There are some things that come through it. But at the end of the day, no matter where you're starting, you can improve. And you can improve in all of these areas, in the complex reasoning, in the verbal, spatial, and abstract reasoning, in the memory, and the executive functions. Betsy shared a story I like to share, but I still remember being an early teacher and having a conversation with a kid after they just read a passage out loud to the class, and you ask them, what was that about, or what was the summary? And they look at you with a blank face like, I wasn't even in class when that happened. And they were the one that read it, because every bit of their executive function went to the process of decoding those words. There was nowhere else for knowledge to be stored. There was no short-term memory, no flexibility in that, and they can't do it. They were maybe nervous, but every bit of their cognitive load went to the process of reading and not analyzing and storing what was read. And that was a he struggled from his teacher that I just finished 4 years of school. They never taught me how to teach kids to think or how to teach kids to remember. And when I remember that very first year of Brainware, where I watched kids go through this, and it clicked for me. These are the things that as a teacher, I can't, or I really struggle with teaching kids. And they can experience some of the frustration. They can experience some of all of that without being worried about a grade, without being worried about a test, without being worried about knowledge as much, because it's gained. And so when I first started this, and we gave our kids the Mindprint assessment, you can see our data there. At the very best, I've got maybe 2 areas that are in the middle. Now we've got a couple that barely broke over that bottom barrier in abstract reasoning and visual memory, but really visual motor speed and processing speed were about average, which makes sense. My kids are great at gaming. My kids are great at processing some of that stuff. But when you start getting into the memory side of things and the perception side of things and flexible thinking, spatial perception, verbal reasoning, those are like way below even like clinical. And so and that's our average. That's our middle. We've got kids significantly below that. And as a school, when she put this up, it wasn't a shock to me, but at the same time, it is a cry for help. So that salmon colored bar was us. And this is my group of kids. We are very high poverty. We are very, very high special ed. I could go on and on about our kiddos. She talked about ACE scores earlier. I had an intervention group a couple of years back, and we went through that process just to talk about it. And in a group of 25 kids, I had over 20 of them that had an ACE score of 6 or higher. And if you have gone into the research of ACE scores, a score of 6 or higher translates to approximately 20 years off of your life, like due to a myriad of other issues. But that's my kid. And so I look at this, and we're beyond most other public schools, most other urban schools, charter schools. The only one that has a higher percent of at-risk kids is a dedicated self-contained special ed school. And so what can we do for these kids? And so, we had the conversation, and I was introduced to Brainware way back in 2019. And so we went through that process with those kids, and I pulled a group of kids out. And again, this was the time when I was still experimenting with a bunch of different interventions. And so I grabbed one of my paraprofessionals, I grabbed my kids, gave them a pep talk. And during our intervention time, they missed out on the other intervention, and they went down to our cafeteria, and I had a paraprofessional put them on their computers and monitor their progress. And they went through the Brainware process. And so for me, this was my little science experiment to say, it makes sense as I watch it, but what about my kids? What about where they're coming from, what their skills are, what their deficits are? What does it do for my kids? And so we went through the process. When we got on board, it was a little bit later in the season, or in the year. So we didn't make it all the way through. They recommend 10 to 14 years. We only made it 8. And they recommend 3 to 5 times each week. We only got 1.5 to 2 by the time we got all the way through there. So
you had a little thing that happened in January too.
Mm-hmm.
Of 2020. Of course, COVID happened. So
a little COVID action. And so we got cut short. I think my school ended up, like most, shutting down in March-ish. So thankfully we had done our diagnostic prior to that, but we saw, we redid Mindprint. We saw percentile gains, especially for our kids who completed at least 12 sections. And so when they're completing those sessions, they're completing those levels, we're seeing that their Mindprint scores are going up. Their ability to process, their ability to reason, their memory, those are the things that are improving. Now, as a teacher and administrator, great, that sounds great, but what does that mean? What does that translate to as far as aptitude, as far as or what is our test score? Because we live in a world of test score. So it's great that my kid can remember more, but what does that mean when it comes test time? And so what we found is even with a abridged version of the program, what we found was we had a significantly higher number of our kids who were 10-point gain in iReady. If you're an iReady district, you know what that means. If you're an NWA or other district, typically by middle school, anywhere from 6 to 13 points is a year's worth of growth. And we were at 70% of kids that were actually meeting their annual typical growth. And so, that was a shock to me. Typically, we're about 55, which is still more than expected, I guess, from that software. And so when I hit 70 with my test group here, I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. Certainly we still had a group of kids that showed no gain, and we got to go back to the drawing board and see what's going on. A lot of times those are kids who may have had a rough day. They didn't take their meds. They had something going on at home. If you live in a high poverty district, you understand that situation. And there's kids that they're going to show a 3 grade level drop in the day, just on the day, because something happened, something's going on, something else has got their focus, and it just is. So, but absolutely seeing that 70% of our kids were hitting their annual typical growth was amazing for me that very first year. And so we broke it down. We are a school that has targeted improvement for special ed. So we started looking at some special ed population data. And again, our kids are growing. Otherwise, the non-brainware kids, they're doing good. We've got, a good chunk of our kids that are moving forward. But what we need are the kids that are the 10 plus. I need not just a year's growth, but I need the more than a year's growth. And I've got 70% of my kids in that brainware group. They got the same interventions, they got other things, but the only difference between these two is brainware. And I've got 15% more of my kids who are hitting that growth goal and closing the gap. Not only, not getting further and further behind, but closing that gap. And so we looked back at this and said, okay, what is it that I can do to prioritize the gains that we're getting in brainware with the kids who need it the most? And so we went through and we've tried it a bunch of different ways. I've tried it in my self-contained special ed classes. I've tried it in a bunch of different avenues. And this year, again, the science person in me continues to, what's the best? We found some really good ways that work. We found some ways to implement, but what can we do now? So we gave Mindprint again to our kids. And so we started looking at kids who were not passing the iLearn. So that was step one. And then we were looking at their Mindprint to find kids who, in the 3 kind of main executive function areas, they were at least average, but fallen way behind in some of the other areas. And I think there's a graph a little bit later that shows that. But so we gave them that, and we're trying to find those kids that have ability in some areas, but they're lacking in some of the other areas. And so the goal, as we talked through it this year, was to use the brainware software to build those kids up, to bring them to average to above average in each of those areas. And so we started with 37 kids this year, and we started going through that process. By the end of the year, we only had 29 kids left for data through, migrant kids or kids moving or kids that didn't test, kids that got kicked out, whatever it is. We got 29 at the end. So this is the data we're talking about for this year. And so much better usage this time. Kids, we talked about the very first one. 12 was our session gap, and the very lowest kid I had this year was 16. The highest I had was 41. And so of the 164 maybe lessons, Betsy, you can chime in, we had kids getting into the 100s, 120s, which is absolutely fantastic. And so much better implementation this year. And I actually ran this through my media center. And so just like last time I had a paraprofessional do it, that's the thing that as an administrator makes brainware doable for me. I don't need to have a certified teacher taking a period out of their day, several periods out of their day to do this. It is very self-paced. It does take a teacher who is an encourager. It takes someone with a personality that motivates, but really they just need time, space, and a place to do it. And so we were able to continue on with our existing schedule and then pull these kids out as needed for their time with Brainware. And so we got some really interesting results. So this was the before. You can see the spatial perception, verbal reasoning, abstract reasoning. Those areas were good. They were mid to upper of the expected. We still have a high level of visual motor speed. I don't know if that's because my kids are gamers or what. We're a STEM school, so as a parent, that just means my kid likes video games, I'm going to put him in that school, which is, again, if you are versed in school choice, sometimes educating the parents is part of that. But over on that left side, you can absolutely see these are kids who are struggling in verbal memory, in visual memory, in flexible thinking, working memory, and attention. Those are the key areas that are preventing them from success. You know, I can fix some of those things, and they're going to be able to better acquire knowledge. They're going to better engage in a classroom. So they have the ability to reason. They have that, but they don't have the sub skills to process what's going on, especially in a high level class. And so what do we do for those kids, and how does Brainware work for this specific subset of kids? And so we look at this, and absolutely across the board, we're looking at, hold on, go back there. So this is our two cohorts, the very first cohort and our last cohort, side by side. Again, on the left side, they're fairly similar. The attention, the memory, the thinking are all low. But instead of grabbing all my kids who were low across the board, we grabbed the low kids who actually had the reasoning skills that were more in the expected range. And so that's something, as this is a different cohort, different kind of test, to see how does Brainware work with these particular kids. And again, these are all kids who have not yet passed the iLearn. And so what do we do, and how do we help these kids is every year's question. And then this was the post for my current cohort. So again, the right side of that, they've all gone up or stayed about the same. Nothing too crazy in there. We've got a couple areas now that were in the expected are now above expected. But if you look over there on the left side, the visual memory, the flexible thinking, the working memory, all of those are up tremendously. We only have one score now that is not an expected with this particular cohort of kids, and that's verbal memory. And so we continue to make that transition from them being maybe not able to pay attention, and now they're in the expected, or they don't have the flexible thinking, and now they're building those skills so that when they're in a science class, a math class, an English class, they're able to process some of those things. And overall, it was a 9 percentile growth, including 15% in the core executive functions. And so that's amazing. We've seen what those kids have done. 58% of my kiddos were experiencing meaningful growth on those executive functioning tests. And so a lot of the yellow kiddos still made gains, but they weren't yet to the 0.25 standard deviation. Again, urban school, if you've got a kid and they're just done, they're done with, I'm not doing this mind print thing again. I already did it, and it's not for a grade, so I don't care. So I'm just going to click through it. You get those kids, but this is what my data was. But I've got 58% of those kids who showed great gains, truly significant gains as to what their ability cognitively is. Another way of expressing that, if you have skills, and on the bottom down in the dark blue, those are areas of weakness, and the top in the light blue, those are areas of strength. Before and after, if you look at the number of skills each student had, they are decreasing the areas of weakness, and we are increasing the areas of strength. So we now have kids in their cognitive skills who have now more strengths than they do weaknesses. And that's absolutely a positive. You know, as Betsy was talking about earlier, as teachers, we try to find those strengths. We try to capitalize on those strengths. If they're a visual kid, then we have them draw. If they're a verbal kid, then we have them write. But the more strengths they have, the more ways we can address a particular area of content with those strengths and weaknesses in mind. And then the other thing to look at here, if you, again, are an iReady person, this looks familiar, but this is relative growth. 100 is the equivalent of a year's growth. And so when I look at this and I look at brainware kiddos, and in the area of math, we were at 1.4 years growth. And in English, we were at 1.1 years of growth. Both of those kids in this cohort have grown more than a year. Their average growth is that they are closing the achievement gap that existed before we started this year. And so absolutely, when I look at this and I look at kids, and as a building, math is an area of weakness for us, that I have kids who on average are growing a year and a half, we're closer to proficiency for these kids who have not yet been proficient. And so that's all I want to see. I want to see that number 100 plus, because that's telling me where they came to me in August and where they're leaving me in May. They are now closer to where they need to be. And again, this is an iReady thing, but we have 40% of our kids who are meeting their stretch target. And stretch target is tremendously difficult for a lot of kids. There's the annual typical target, and then there's the stretch target. But stretch target is what is needed for these kids. If they're going to continue to grow and hit that stretch target, then they're going to leave us proficient. And so for some kids, it may be 2 years is their stretch goal. Some kids, it might be 2.5 years is their stretch goal, depending on how far behind they happen to be. But the fact that 40% of these kids met their stretch goal is absolutely fantastic. And so, you know, a lot of them hit their expected targets. That's their year's growth. And we have this, you know, small chunk over here where they didn't have their targets met. Again, I don't want to berate the same point, but you've got kids that if it's not for a grade and they're not going to care about it, you're just not going to get it. And then so my question is, I don't have a year down the road data for my kids. And so it makes sense to me that if their cognitive skills are better, if their memory is better, if their flexible thinking is better, their ability to acquire knowledge in class is better. And so just like what we did with iLearn, with iReady, I get my data, you know, 3 times a year. I don't have 23 iLearn data to compare for my kiddos, but I reached out to a colleague. This is his data for his middle school. And so what I would expect is gains of similar nature, where we are growing our kids maybe 5, maybe 10% every year to get them closer and closer to passing. And the other thing to look at is down the road. This isn't just a short-term fix. These kids have grown in their ability and their ability to process, their memory, their thinking. I am curious, as I continue to model these different cohorts of kids, because they didn't hit that threshold. If the goal is maybe 12, is 16, is whatever sessions to build that skill up, now they're able to sit in class with these skills. And, you know, all year they were building those skills. So we've grown in the process. But down the road, what's the next year? And what do we do? And so, again, iLearn, same sort of things that you saw with my iReady. And I'm sure I will be compiling the data with my iLearn data here when we get it back in another week or 2 from the state. And I expect to see similar results where we've got kids who are growing in their areas. Their scores are going up, their levels are going up, and they're getting closer and closer to that proficient. If I've got a kid that's below proficiency, I want them to be at approaching. If they're at approaching, I want them to be at. And as we continue to get a year older, not only do we have to grow a year, but we've got to grow a year plus. And same sort of thing, you can see his difference. His school's doing great. They went from 46 to 53%. But when you look over on the right 2 categories, his brainware groups, I mean, this green doesn't show up on your letter grade. You had 25% of kids who were approaching, and now you're at 48% of kids. You had 65% of kids who were below, and you now have 29%. All of those kids, doesn't matter. They still show up as not passing. That doesn't count in your proficiency. But when you look at this as an educator and you say, oh my word, half of my kids who are approaching are now at, and half of my below kids, more than half of my below kids are now approaching, I have moved those kids. Those kids are now set up for success going forward with the improved skills for them to make that next jump, so that if I can take half of this green group and move them up, I'm moving 24% up into 24%. I'm now at 48% from 10 2 years earlier. And that's when you start seeing the power of this. It's not just a 1 year short-term thing. Those kids continue to move. So I'm excited about my data moving forward and trying to figure out what do we do and how do we move those kids from blue to green, green to yellow.
Great. So just want to open it up now for questions. And so feel free to type questions in the Q&A, or because we're a small group, would love for people to unmute themselves and just ask Tom directly.
If you think of something later, my email is, I think, at the end of this, but it is thhughes@kokomo.k12.in.us. So feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to share what we've done, what we have learned, what we have done wrong, all that kind of stuff. It is absolutely something I want to share. It's Brainware, something that's different, something different than what we've tried, something results wise different than what we've gotten. And if you're in a similar situation where you're finding yourself struggling to engage kids, games are the way. If you're having kids that have behavior problems, inhibitory control is going to help with that. So how do we build those skills? As an administrator, I have very little ability to be with those kids to change those things. I'm usually after the fact. They've messed up. I already know they don't have the inhibitory control to sit in that math class. So try and talk to them, talk some sense into them, and put them in a room for a day or whatever the consequence may be. But that doesn't actually fix the inhibitory control. It's the kid that goes home, gets spanked, gets yelled at, gets things taken away, and they say they're going to do better, and the next day they don't. It's not because they don't know better. It's not because they don't want to do better. It's because they don't have the inhibitory control to, as Betsy said, not punch them in the nose.
We do have a question from Brandy. Is your school using, I'm not sure if she means this the way she wrote it, but
Brainware and iReady. So absolutely. Brainware is part of our intervention. iReady is our formative assessment tool. We still use iReady. We use Teacher Toolbox. Our teachers use it. It's part of our interventions. It's part of our Tier 1. We use the Standards Mastery in our Tier 1 classes as one piece of data that we look at in our PLCs. We use iReady tremendously. It is certainly not a replacement for iReady, but whereas iReady is, academic focused, standards focused, Brainware has nothing to do with standards. There's nothing, and I tell kids that at the very beginning, you're not going to know anything more by going through Brainware. Like, you're not going to magically know the capital of, Russia because you went through Brainware. You're not going to know how many continents there are because you went through Brainware. Brainware is the ability to improve the functions that allow you to better utilize the time spent in those Tier 1 classes. So it is a supplement to both the Brainware and the iReady. Great question.
Okay. Anyone else? And as we, here we're getting, thank you. Do you believe Brainware Do you do brainware with all
all
students?
or low students? I've done it all sorts of different ways, but not just low. There was a time, this would have been my 21 COVID year implementation, that I pushed it to my special ed teachers. So they pushed it out during their resource time with their TOR kids. And we saw good gains there. So I've done it with all kids, with low kids, but for the most part, it is all good kiddos. And so time per week is my answer is flexible. Betsy has the scientific answer, but 3 times a week for 30 to 45 minutes is good. There are better, but if you can carve out some time, I do it. We have a school-wide intervention period that's 38 minutes long. And so kids are tiered based on some of their diagnostics, some of their standards masteries to get additional help. And so these kids just get pulled out of that. They do miss out on some of the math and English academic intervention at that time. But as you can see in our results, the fact that they're growing in their cognitive ability is something that far surpasses the gains that their peers have seen when they were in the different interventions. So, my wondering down the road, I've not yet done this with my entire building. That's something that I'm looking at, or particularly a grade. Maybe every 6th grader that shows up to me goes through brainware as part of 6th grade. And so by the time, 3 years later is done, I have now gone through every kid. So that is one of the things that I'm pondering, mulling over for next year, is to try and find a way to get more kids in this. Because as you can see, it's great. It's great to see what those kids are able to do, but it's the linear progression down the road of not only this year, what did they learn, but what are they continuing to learn in the future. Cost, I'm going to give you ballparks, but I know Betsy's going to yell at me because I'm going to give wrong information. But I will tell you that I've talked with Betsy, and I have talked with Roger, who's also on this slide that you guys are looking at, and they love Indiana. Roger is a Hoosier. He grew up in Indy, went to Arsenal Tech, and so we get a special price, which Betsy, I don't know if you want to chime in. It's, I don't know, 300-ish maybe.
Well, actually, that's going to be the price for the non-ESC members, I think, next year. But so right now, if you wanted to, think about planning ahead and making the commitment, it's actually less than that. It's and Trish can follow up with everybody after this and share the exact pricing, so we get you exactly what you need. But Brandy has asked another great question, Tom, which is because we've been obviously focused on middle school, and while you are middle school, I know you can, if you can think about how you might do this at other levels, that would be great input.
Absolutely. I wish I had K-8. And actually, my district is opening up an elementary on my campus, and this will be a conversation I have with the principal that takes over that elementary. But I will tell you, absolutely elementary. The earlier we can close some of these cognitive gaps, the better off that kid's going to be. Because, I could pull up my data for you, and when I am a 6th grader coming to my middle school, if I look at iLearn, or I look at iReady, I have 60% of my kids who are 2 or 3 years behind. It would be an amazing thing if we were able to address some of these things prior to the fact that they're 2 and 3 years behind, coming to me at the middle school level, wanting to fix some of these and having to be creative to do that. It is something that, it would absolutely be a tremendous tool for an elementary school. And I know there are school districts in Indiana. I've talked to some of the principals that help them with the implementation, where they are rolling this out in the upper elementaries. I can tell you, my 8-year-old's gone through Mindprint. And my 6-year-old will continue this trend as he gets a little bit older. 6 is a little bit early, but as he gets a little bit older, yeah, I'm going to put him on this as well for my own 2 kiddos, because I truly think you can't have enough skill in the area of thinking, because that's our world. Our world is, I can ask Siri knowledge, but Siri doesn't think. And so how do I build up kids so that they aren't just knowers, but they are thinkers? And this is the best thing that I found for my own 2 and for my school.
So Brandy, we generally don't recommend it below 3rd grade in school. Sometimes people can, the Brainware is Mindprint, the assessment is for 8 and up. So those are where that's appropriate, and up through, adults and whatever. Brainware can be used as young as 6, but in schools, it tends to be children have to know the alphabet and their numbers to 100. That's the only content knowledge they really need to have. And it's most easy to implement at 3rd grade. By the time kids are in 3rd grade, then having a coach, a teacher who's a coach or an encourager, as Tom referred to it, with a larger group of students is very manageable. And when you talk about, who you use it with, we have used it with to help more children qualify for gifted programs. We've used it with special ed students. We've used it really across the board in different places, and have a lot of research on each of those groups. The thing that I would say is, if you're going to implement it, do it with a group that where you can manage it, where you can make sure that they're using the program consistently. It's nice to say, oh, it's for everybody and implement it across the board. But if you can't effectively get everybody using the program and following the protocol, then it's not going to be effective, obviously. So, thinking about, it's usually of the schedule, and where the computers are, and how you can find an appropriate staff person. Again, as Tom said, it does not have to be a certified teacher. It can be a para, or it can be someone who had a media center responsibility.
I look at it, and you mentioned 3rd grade, so we give iRead, we have kids, they don't pass. And then what do? We do some sort of reading recovery, we do some tutoring, we do some summer school. But the vast majority of that is like small group, one-on-one. Okay, I've got an interventionist and she's going to pull out these 2 or 3 kids. That's what I have continued to find, is a lot of those programs, they work. They work, those kids that are in there. But I don't have that certified teacher to do reading recovery with all 30 kids that need it, at least in any meaningful amount of time. But if that reading recovery time could be spent doing something like this, and I could get 10 times as many kids in there, I could put the entire class in there, or I could put, a handful of classes of kids who are of need. Man, that's a better time spent with those kiddos. And this is in addition to, maybe there are some kids that need that one-on-one time, but this is something that I can do with my STEM teacher, with my media clerk, with my whoever. My counselor can take a group of kids, because all they're doing is problem solving with the kids, because they're frustrated. They are frustrated, but a lot of it is go back and reread the instructions. And because it isn't a grade, it isn't frustration because I failed a test or I failed an assignment. It's frustration because I got to redo this level with this little jaguar running around. It's okay. These kids will sit on a video game and play the same stinking level 5 hours at a time to pass it. They don't think anything about that. These are the same kids that wouldn't spend 5 minutes on a math problem. They look at it and they say it's too hard. So when you put them in that scenario, their likelihood of continuing to persevere in that situation is so much higher.
Hopefully we've addressed those questions. Feel free to, we got,
I got it.
Oh, email again?
Yep.
Okay, great. He's going to start, but it's right on the screen too. Hopefully everybody can see it.
And yeah, if you have any questions, I mean, I get nothing for being here other than I continue to love implementing it in my building, and that's all I want for you. You know, as teachers, as administrators in other buildings, it just, it's something to try. I could go through the list of all the other things I've tried and all the other programs, and I'm sure the same ones you guys are currently doing or trying. But give this a shot. It's different, and it has been tremendous in what it's been able to do for our kiddos.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little workshop. I'm going to get my on cognitive skills, and just to just dig in a little bit more. And I do want to say that we would be happy to provide the opportunity for anyone who is on here to take the MindPrint assessment yourself, so that you can experience it and see what it's like, and see sort of all the information that's available once it has been taken. Or if you would like to use it with you have children of your own who are 8 and up, or if you have a student or two that you'd like to, this sort of puzzled you, and you want to check them out and have them take the assessment so that you can see the kind of information that's available. So please feel free to contact me or Trish if that is something that you would like to pursue. And again, we'll put our contact information back up. So again, just want to come back to this slide. These are the skills that are being assessed in the MindPrint assessment. 3 areas of complex reasoning: verbal, spatial, and abstract. The 2 types of memory, longer-term memory that we discussed, executive functions, and processing speed. So just want to go through and talk a little bit about each of these, and ask you to think about either yourself or a child or a student that you may have in mind about which skill in each of these categories might be your strongest or their strongest. Are you better at understanding and applying what you read and hear with language-based information, or are you better at physically in space, how things fit together and work together? Or are you more of an abstract? And do you have strong general conceptual reasoning skills, seeing patterns and that kind of thing? Then I want you to think about your memory skills. We sort of talked about this before. Do you have stronger verbal memory or stronger visual memory? I have stronger verbal memory. If I need to remember something that's visual, I need to describe it to myself and put words around it. So I would say things like, there was a slide and it had a title and it had 2 bullet points, and one was visual and one was verbal. When I do that, then it makes it much more memorable for me. Executive functions: working memory, attention, and flexible thinking. I put an asterisk next to attention because, as I told you earlier in this in our session today, it's actually inhibitory control is the 3rd cognitive assessment that is generally recognized and as one of the executive functions. The test in the MindPrint assessment is called attention. It does incorporate aspects of inhibitory control. So I just wanted not to have that be confusing, but it will look at, so attention and inhibitory control are closely related. Working memory and flexible thinking are the other 2. And think about which might be strengths and which might be stumbling blocks for you or for a student, the way that they are for many students. And then processing speed. And when we talk about processing speed, faster is not always better. I often see students who have very fast processing speed just because they race through things and they don't move things at a deliberate pace or a consistent pace. So you can have processing speed that's too fast, that causes you to make a lot of careless errors and all that kind of thing. Or you can have processing speed that is too slow, that doesn't, where you're just always a little bit behind, and it makes it more difficult to get your work done and to keep up with your class and all that kind of thing. So I have a couple of students here. I want to show you their MindPrint profiles, the summary of them, and just talk a little bit, and feel free to unmute yourself, ask questions, jump in here, think about this. So this is a student. Alex is not their real name. I just made that up, but it's a real student. And you can see their strength. We always like to focus on strengths first. And what MindPrint allows us to do is to focus not only on where students are behind. You know, we're always talking about gaps and behind and things like that. What we can do when we understand a student's strengths is help them use those strengths to improve their academic performance and to make things easier. So not only can we build them up and strengthen these skills the way that we talked about with Tom's students, but we can also give them strategies to help them implement. So we would help them use their stronger visual memory to support their weaker verbal memory. This is a student who's got very strong ability to sustain their attention, good visual motor speed, so eye-hand coordination and reaction time. Their reasoning skills are, at least when it comes to visual, spatial, and abstract reasoning, really solid, right in the middle of the expected range. They can shift gears and think in different ways. They process well. But here are the stumbling blocks: working memory and verbal reasoning. So what you're going to we can understand by this is this student is, in terms of verbal reasoning, is going to struggle with drawing inferences, using figurative language, using language to explain things. If he's or she, well, this is Alex, so this is he, sitting in the classroom, listening to the teacher talk and describe things the way that I am now, that is going to be a real struggle for this child to understand whatever it is that we're asking them to understand. Far better to draw a picture, a diagram, a chart, to illustrate it, to have them work with a model of some kind, to build a model. That's going to help this child understand it. And then working memory, of course, we're going to want to help find supports for that. Writing things down, you know, if they've asked to do a list of things, keeping track of the steps and checking them off as they're going through them, those kinds of strategies are going to be very helpful. Now, here's a very different kind of a student. This actually is, I'm not going to say who it is, but it's one of the educators who's going to be part of our webinar tomorrow, and who did take this herself. I will say that it's a she. And a very different kind of a learner. If you look up here in spatial perception, this little star next to spatial perception means that she scored in the top 5% of the population. So she is gifted. She is gifted in spatial perception. So if you are standing in the driveway trying to figure out how to fit all the luggage in the trunk for your vacation trip, call Alice. If you need to think about a complex problem and analyze it and compare it to other things, and call Alice. She is going to be able to think through things. She may not be able to explain them quite as well to you. And in fact, this makes an interesting point. So her verbal reasoning is solid, right in the middle of the expected range, but her visual and spatial reasoning skills are so much stronger. And so she may find it actually very frustrating when someone is explaining something to her and not drawing her a picture. And our students will experience this a lot, because it's these differences in the strength of skills that can be frustrating. Some things are much easier, some things are much harder. And so when we help them understand that, it makes it a lot clearer to them. And then they have some tools that they can use. So when Alice learns this, she may feel very reassured that it's not that she's not capable in this area of verbal reasoning, but that she is so much stronger in these other areas that she can use that to her benefit. Now, so we've got a student here, not really, who's got great reasoning skills, solid verbal reasoning. Everything else is in the middle of the expected range, but we're going to look over here under skills to support, and in flexible thinking, it's the ability to shift gears and think about things from different perspectives. She is in the bottom 5% of the population. So she is going to struggle with certain tasks, probably much more than we might guess, because if her first approach doesn't work, she is going to have difficulty adjusting and taking feedback. And, you know, this works, this doesn't work, and will tend to stick with her first approach to something as opposed to adjusting it. So again, when we know that about this, we're not going to try and solve her reasoning problem, her reasoning skills, because those are really good. What we're going to do is help her to learn the steps that can be involved and a checklist that she can go through when she is in that position of feeling stuck, or when she's in that position of something didn't work and I don't know why. So how am I going to adjust? How am I going to regroup? What are the things that I can do? And to be aware that she may have more difficulty than others looking at things from multiple perspectives. So I'm going to go back, see if we have, I don't see any questions. Feel free to unmute though. This is your time. Trish, did you want to jump in and add anything?
Of course I do. Now, the main thing I would like to express at this point is that this is like going to the gym for your brain, you know, and all of us have tried to do a workout routine from time to time. And we know that there are things that we like to do because it's easier for us or we're more adept at doing it, but it's the stuff that is hard for us to do. This is where, you know, brainware makes a very big difference, because as Tom said, kids try it and try it and try it. And that's creating those pathways. And it just takes a little bit longer. And the other thing I wanted to say is that, well, of course, I always like to say this helps kids know they're not stupid. They just learn differently. And that right there is a blessing to those kids. And then the third thing I want to say is when kids go through this process and we start working with the processing, the verbal memory, the spatial relationships, those kinds of things with them, that creates a feedback loop. And as long as they are going to be in an academic environment where they can use those processes and those neurons keep firing, that's going to be reinforcing. So when I heard Tom say he'd like to use it on and on and on, I'd like to make sure that people understand, yes, kids can have access to this brainware and continue using it if they want, but what he's talking about is adding more kids to the cohort so that they will learn better. And that in itself will increase the quality of the learning environment for everybody, because it cuts down on disruptions and you have kids feeling better about themselves and interacting better with their peers and the adults in their world. And that's a happy thing.
We might want, and maybe Tom wants to jump in again at this point, but I think that the notion behind his, when he was talking about, you know, perhaps ideally implementing at 6th grade, was that all of his 6th grade students would then, or most of them at least, would be then moving on from 6th grade with these stronger skills. And one of the things that we do see over and over is that in other interventions are more effective and more quickly effective following training with Brainware Safari, which just makes a lot of sense. When you have these skills, you expect learning to be more efficient. And and that's what we see. So the notion is not that you, and in fact, you do not need to do, for most students, will not need to repeat Brainware over another year. It is like an intervention where you do this and then they have stronger skills and they take that forward with them into all of their learning experiences. So I think that when Tom was talking about that, he was saying implement it at 6th grade so that then they have those skills when they get to 7th and 8th grade.
Yep. So the plan is not that they do Brainware every year, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, but make the gains as a 6th grader so that we can reap the fruits of it as 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, rather than, because right now I've got kids that are 7th and 8th graders in Brainware. Not that that's not helpful to that kid, but as part of a building and improving student achievement, be better off to get those skills at least into the expected level, and a couple of them up into the above level, so that they're better learners for the 3 years that we've got them.
Okay. So I put back up the slide with our contact information. I know that Tom and Trish and I and Roger as well would be delighted to follow up, answer any questions, set you up to experience the Mindprint assessment. The only information I would need to set you up with one of your students, one of your children, is I need their first and last name, birth date, and gender. If it's for yourself, you do not need to give me your birth date. That will remain a secret, because we'll simply set you up as an adult to over 21. And so other than that, but if it's a younger child between 8 and 21, we would need to know what year, what month and year they were born. All right. Hearing no questions, seeing no additional questions, I want to thank everyone so much. I particularly want to thank Tom for joining us this morning. I'm sure he's got a lot of things happening in his building, as always, and probably needs to run off and deal with those things. So particularly appreciate his being here and sharing with everybody today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And again, we'll send out a link to the recording and encourage you to follow up, and whatever we can do, we're here to help and support you and make your students more successful, not just for iLearn, which we do care about, but for the rest of their lives. All right, well, I'm going to stop sharing and disconnect. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you soon, we hope.